In this lesson, we're going to learn that science is a recent cultural discovery, which of course has changed the world and our understanding of it. Now, to situate the emergence of science in the larger human story, we're going to use some timelines here. And if we go to the bottom timeline, we're going to go back into the deep history of humanity. Some 6 million years ago, our human ancestors split from the chimps, from a common ancestor, an ape ancestor living in the forest. And in the subsequent 6 million years, our ancestors underwent significant changes, from four-legged locomotion to bipedal locomotion, 2 legs. And then some of our ancestors started using stone tools, incorporating more meat into their diet. Their brains were getting larger, and we became a cultural species dependent upon cultural learning for success. We tamed fire, and along the way, somewhere, our ancestors began to use language. Now, in this last segment here, 200,000 years is represented by the middle timeline here. So modern humans have been around for at least 200,000, perhaps 300,000 years. And for most of that time, we were hunter-gatherers. It's only much more recently that we began to settle down and farm, do agriculture, and domesticate animals. And then we see writing. And if we magnify this bit of the timeline, that's the top timeline here. Here we have 15,000 years ago, the first settlements and temples, and farming begins, and we have sort of civilization, living in cities with organized religion and writing and other technologies like the wheel and so on. And then we get to the Greek philosophers, and then today. So we don't yet have the emergence of modern science pictured on our timeline. But before we get to that, let's note that for most of human history, the way humans have understood their environment and their place in the world is through myths and religions. And these kinds of systems of belief attempted to describe and explain the natural world as well as our role in it. But then something changes. Here we have our final timeline going from 2,500 years ago, but then we've got a break here and looking at the last 400, 500 years. In the 1500s to the 1600s, something special emerges, the scientific method. Now you'll notice that it's only after the emergence of modern science that we get lots of basic discoveries, in this case about biology. So most of what we know about our world and the entire universe is only a few hundred years old, and it's rooted in the emergence of the scientific method. Let's just look at a couple of the discoveries. Well, here we see in the 1600s microscopes were invented, and so early users of the microscope were putting everything they could under the microscope, and in time biologists discovered that living things were composed of cells. Now it took another, from the 1700s, it took another 100 years for scientists to conclude that all living things are made of cells. But the cell theory is a pillar of modern biology. And of course, the reason why living things can reproduce with heredity, passing on traits, is because living things are made of cells, and cells have the capacity to reproduce. In the 1800s, scientists began to understand that some diseases were caused by tiny cells we call bacteria. And this is Pasteur's germ theory of disease. And this led to ways of trying to kill these bacteria with antibiotics. And this was a major improvement to the overall health of humanity. Back here in the 1600s, we have early investigators like Harvey and Van Helmont trying to understand anatomy and physiology of animals and how do plants survive. And of course, in the mid-1800s, we get the towering figure of Charles Darwin, who helped us understand the origin of species, that new species can evolve from pre-existing species, and species number can increase over time. All living species today are related by common ancestry. And again, this is a major pillar of modern biology. So the emergence of the scientific method, this was yet a new way to describe and explain the natural world, different from myths and religions. But why did knowledge explode after the scientific revolution? This explosion of knowledge, there's nothing like it in the history of myth and religion. And it has to do with the method. The method of science efficiently eliminates inaccurate ideas. So we'll see there's something about this method that is really good at getting rid of ideas that don't really match up to reality. And so narrowing our focus on ideas that do seem to correspond in important ways to the way the world works. Now, the foundations for modern science that emerged in the 1600s can be traced back to the ancient Greeks. Greek thinkers laid the foundations for modern politics, philosophy, law, and science in the Western cultural tradition. And the key cultural innovation was the following: the pursuit of rational inquiry through adversarial discussion, where you have discussion between two people or groups of people where they're kind of, arguing and debating each other and checking each other and sometimes agreeing with each other, but sometimes not. That was the key idea, and the Greeks applied this attitude, this value of adversarial discussion to these domains of social life. In politics, when you do adversarial discussion, you get something like a democracy, where supporters of rival policies debate and vote. In philosophy, adversarial discussion shows up in the following way: logic, reasoned arguments, and dialogue are used to discover the nature of truth, justice, knowledge, beauty, etc. So you're going to have philosophers proposing a definition for truth or justice or knowledge, and then you'll have other philosophers that are going to criticize that definition and come up with counterexamples that seem to undermine that definition and proposing a better definition, but then the other philosophers are going to disagree with that. So you're going to get this adversarial discussion. And hopefully, after having that discussion, these important concepts will become more clear. Perhaps there will be some consensus achieved by the participants. In law, the adversarial discussion takes the form of our adversarial legal system. Accusers and the accused offer different versions of events, from which others determine the truth and administer justice. So again, we have the prosecution and we have the defense, and somehow the jury has got to make sense of it all. And in science, hypothesis generation and testing. So the practitioners construct rival theories to explain natural phenomena and test them against nature. But again, you're going to have adversarial discussion because there will be different scientists proposing different hypotheses, and they will be debating their hypotheses given the evidence they've collected from the scientific method. So one way to summarize this, what's common about this approach, applying adversarial discussion to all of these domains, is that the Greeks were really fond of orderly competition with rules. Just as we see in athletics, which were happening in ancient times, so too in these social domains. Orderly competition with rules. And the Greeks placed a high value on this because they thought that produced positive, virtuous outcomes for society. Now, why the delay then? So if the Greeks came up with this great idea of adversarial discussion applied to all these domains, why didn't modern science start 2,500 years ago? Well, one way of looking at this is the Greeks were very clever in producing hypotheses to explain various phenomena in nature, and they would have their discussions. But what they did not do is systematically test these ideas against nature with experiments. Now, in modern science, experiments are a key tool in the investigation of nature. And by experiment here, we mean that scientists are trying to gain control of the variables that they're trying to study. So we have an experimental condition that has the variable and the control condition that lacks the variable, and then you compare the results and then you draw your conclusions. So The attitude of using an experiment means that you're trying to isolate the factor that you're interested in and then let nature, through the results of the experiment, decide whether a particular hypothesis is supported or weakened. And if the results weaken the hypothesis, then we want to discard the hypothesis. Well, the Greeks didn't seem to be in the habit culturally of doing this testing of their ideas with experiments. So back to the question of why did all of this knowledge emerge only after the emergence of the modern scientific method? And that's because the method efficiently eliminates inaccurate ideas. And to see how this works, it's helpful to look at a few examples. But before we get to actual examples in the history of science, let's look more generally at what is the scientific thinking format. It's outlined here on this slide. So here's how the thinking goes. If we take some hypothesis to be true, and a hypothesis is an attempt to explain something, and we perform an experiment to test that hypothesis, then we can make a prediction. If the hypothesis is true and we conduct some kind of experiment, we should be able to make a prediction about what results will come from that experiment. Well, then we actually get the results, and then we compare the results of our experiment to the prediction that we made, assuming the hypothesis was true. And so if the results match the prediction, our interpretation is the hypothesis will be supported. If the results do not match the prediction, we say the hypothesis is weakened. So the thinking format is structured so that we can either support or weaken the various hypotheses that we're testing with our experiments. Now let's look at an example from the history of science, in this case, our understanding of the role of the heart. In ancient times, the Roman physician Galen followed earlier thinkers in the belief that the heart was a furnace, the source of the body's innate heat. So notice the metaphor. The heart, this object in our chest, is a furnace, something known to the ancients. Of course, today we think of the heart as a pump, but the ancients didn't have pumps in their time, so they weren't able to compare the heart to that technology, which did not exist. So for Galen and others, the heart was a furnace. Now, there were some other ideas that Galen had that we need to understand before we see how William Harvey is going to start to test these ancient ideas. First, take a look at this diagram. Here we have the heart, and here we have the lungs, and there are some sort of tubes connecting the two. So here are three important beliefs in Galen's physiology. Number one, the right ventricle sends blood to the lungs to keep the lungs alive. Now it turns out the way textbooks do this, while it appears to be the left chamber of the heart, textbooks are going to call this the right ventricle. And indeed, we see blood is being sent to the lungs. Now Galen thought the blood went to the lungs just to nourish the lungs, to keep them alive. Number two, air from the lungs, so when we inhale, we fill the lungs with air. Air from the lungs is sent down into the left ventricle of the heart. So notice this connecting tube here did not have blood in Galen's view, it had air. And Galen's third point, blood from the right ventricle moves through the septum to the left ventricle. We'll see in a moment there's a thick muscular wall separating the right and left ventricle in the heart. Well, Galen believed that blood in the right ventricle had to move through tiny holes to get to the left, because otherwise there was no other way the blood could get to the left ventricle of the heart. So you see, the issue for Galen was he did not understand that in reality blood is pumped through the lungs and then comes back to the other side of the heart, to the left ventricle. Galen did not understand that. And so Galen was left to say, well, the blood in the right side of the heart must go through this muscular wall called the septum into the left ventricle. So this arrangement of the heart and the lungs and these tubes connecting them, it helped Galen understand why it is that we have to breathe. We breathe in order to get air sent down into the left ventricle of the heart to mix with blood from the right ventricle. And that mixture of blood with air, it helped to refine the blood. So there were lots of things wrong about Galen's views of the heart and the lungs. But the thing is, people didn't test these ideas in his time. Here we see a cross-section through the heart, and now we can see the right ventricle here and the left ventricle here and this thick muscular wall called the septum. So again, Galen's view was that blood could move through the septum. It must have had tiny, tiny holes that were not visible to the casual inspection, but somehow blood must be moving through tiny holes into the left ventricle. Now that idea can be tested directly, but the ancients didn't do that. We'll have to wait for William Harvey. So here's a nice example of a more modern sensibility to test the ideas of those who came before. So here's the thinking in Harvey's mind. If fluid can pass through the septum through tiny holes, and we inject high pressure water into the right ventricle, then water should emerge in the left ventricle. So before we get to the results, let's just see what we're saying here is we take the hypothesis as true. If fluid can pass through the septum, through tiny holes, and we inject high pressure fluid into the right ventricle, then that fluid should emerge in the left ventricle because there are holes there. The actual results, no water was found in the left ventricle, and so since the results do not match the prediction, we say the hypothesis is weakened. Notice what that does for Harvey is that if blood cannot move through the septum, then maybe blood from the right ventricle really does go through the lungs and come back to the left ventricle. Harvey's going to start to formulate this idea that blood is circulating. Take another example in the history of our understanding of plants. Van Helmont tested an idea that was very common in ancient times. Consider this picture down here. We have a small plant. 5 years later, it has grown to a large size. Well, lots of folks in ancient times thought what plants were doing when they were growing is they were utilizing soil to build new plant tissue. Yes, everybody knew that water was involved as well, but many people believed that plants were converting soil into new plant tissue. So look at the thinking. If plants increase their weight due to substances gained from the soil only, and we measure the weight of the plant and soil both before and after growth, then the weight of the new plant tissue should equal the weight of the soil lost. Notice, in making our prediction, we always assume that the hypothesis is true, and we make our prediction based on what we're doing in our experiment, assuming the hypothesis is true. If plants are really just turning soil into new plant tissue, then the weight of the soil lost should equal the weight of the new plant material gained. What were the results? In 5 years' growth, the plant gained 165 pounds and the soil lost just a mere 2 ounces. And that result clearly does not match the prediction, so we say the hypothesis is weakened. Now Van Helmont went on to then hypothesize that perhaps it is indeed the water that plants are using to turn into new plant tissue. But again, when you do a similar experiment like he did with soil, you find that the plants are gaining more weight than the water that was used. And so other thinkers came along and said, oh, here's what's going on. The plants are also absorbing some substance from the air, and we now know that to be carbon dioxide. So our modern understanding is that plants are using water and carbon dioxide to build glucose. And what gets liberated in that chemistry is oxygen, and that's our modern understanding of photosynthesis. But the point is that it's only in the 1500s and 1600s that people started to systematically test ancient ideas. So some of these ancient ideas were maintained for 1500 years and nobody tested them. And this is why we're going to call the emergence of modern science a cultural discovery. It was just a new attitude came over people who were beginning to question whether the ancient ideas of human anatomy and plant physiology and our location in the solar system, whether these ancient ideas were correct or not. So this is what we mean that the method efficiently eliminates inaccurate ideas. Modern scientists test hypotheses with experiments when they can, or just observations when they can't actually perform an experiment. But still, the idea is to always try to test ideas with some kind of observation or experiment. And evidently, in ancient times, this just was not practiced with any kind of regularity.